Hey there, welcome back to True Crime Records. Tonight, we're not following a single name, a single crime scene, or a single suspect. Instead, we're stepping quietly into something far more subtle, a technology that waits patiently, sometimes for decades, before it speaks. For years, cold cases lived in silence. Evidence sat untouched. Families aged without answers. And investigators were forced to accept a painful truth that some crimes might never be solved. Then something changed. Not with a confession, not with a witness, but with a strand of DNA. A few invisible markers, preserved across time, suddenly became capable of pointing backward through generations, toward relatives, toward family trees, toward people who never knew they were connected to a crime at all. This is the story of genetic genealogy, the science that began catching killers 40 years after they thought they were safe. Tonight, we'll move slowly and clearly through how this technology works, why it succeeded where traditional policing failed, and how it quietly reshaped modern justice. Not through force or urgency, but through patience, probability, and time. Before we begin, take a moment to tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if calm, long-form true crime documentaries like this help you unwind and reflect, subscribe to True Crime Records for nightly stories told without rush. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. When Evidence Went Quiet. For most of modern criminal history, investigations were limited by what could be seen, heard, or remembered. A crime was solved through witnesses who came forward, fingerprints left behind, confessions extracted, or suspects who made mistakes. When those elements failed to appear, cases slowed. When time passed, they froze. Evidence that could not speak was boxed, labeled, and stored away, sometimes revisited years later, sometimes never again. These unsolved cases became known as cold cases, not because they mattered less, but because the trail that once felt warm and possible had gone quiet. Detectives understood this silence well. They knew that memories fade, witnesses move or die, and physical evidence degrades. In many investigations, time was not a neutral factor. It actively worked against the truth. Throughout the 20th century, countless families were told the same thing in different words. There were no new leads. There was nothing more to follow. Investigators would keep the file open, but quietly. Expectations were lowered. In these cases, justice became conditional, dependent on chance encounters, unexpected confessions, or accidental discoveries. When those never came, the case remained unresolved, suspended between hope and resignation. This was the reality for decades. Crime labs could test blood types, compare hair samples, and examine fibers, but these methods were limited. They could exclude suspects, but rarely identify unknown offenders with certainty. The introduction of DNA profiling in the late 1980s offered a breakthrough, but even this early technology had boundaries. DNA could confirm guilt or innocence only if there was someone to compare it to. Databases like Cody's relied on profiles from people who had already been arrested or convicted. If a perpetrator had never been caught before, their DNA simply existed as an anonymous sequence, accurate but useless. Many offenders understood this gap. They were careful. They avoided arrest. And over time, they began to believe that distance alone would protect them. Cold cases accumulated. Entire eras of crime were defined by what could not be solved. Serial offenders disappeared without explanation. Victims were left without names to attach to their trauma. Investigators retired carrying unanswered questions with them. The justice system learned to live with uncertainty, treating it as an unfortunate but inevitable outcome. What few people realized was that evidence never truly forgets. It waits. As technology advanced outside law enforcement, something subtle was happening. Scientists studying genetics were learning more about inheritance, probability, and shared markers passed down through generations. DNA was no longer viewed only as a personal identifier, but as a map of relationships. Every individual carried within them a record of their ancestors, parents, grandparents, distant cousins, encoded in microscopic sequences. This knowledge existed long before it was applied to criminal cases, but it planted a seed. If DNA could show who you were related to, then it could also show who you were not alone. For decades, this idea remained theoretical. Law enforcement focused on direct matches, not family connections. The tools to analyze massive genetic networks did not yet exist, and the ethical questions surrounding such methods had not been explored. But quietly, the foundation was being laid. Cold cases were not waiting for confessions or witnesses anymore. They were waiting for science to catch up. This chapter of forensic history is not about a single crime or a single criminal. It is about the moment when evidence stopped being silent, when DNA was no longer just a comparison tool, but a storyteller, when time, once the enemy of justice, began to work in its favor, and when cases long thought unsolvable began to shift, not suddenly, not loudly, but patiently, as the past prepared to speak again. When DNA first entered the criminal justice system, it was treated as a miracle. For the first time, investigators had access to a biological fingerprint that could not be altered, forgotten, or convincingly denied. Blood, saliva, and skin cells became witnesses that did not lie. Early DNA profiling helped exonerate the innocent and confirm the guilt of those already suspected. Courtrooms changed. Juries learned new language. Science became part of the legal process in a way it never had before. But beneath the excitement, there were limitations that were not always visible to the public. DNA, as powerful as it was, still depended on comparison. It could only answer one question clearly. Does this DNA belong to this person? And if there was no person to compare it to, the answer stopped there. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, national DNA databases expanded rapidly. Law enforcement agencies collected genetic profiles from people arrested or convicted of certain crimes, and these profiles were stored for future comparison. When DNA from a crime scene matched a profile already in the system, cases could move quickly. Arrests followed. Prosecutions succeeded. But when there was no match, the DNA became an orphaned record. It existed, fully accurate, yet disconnected from any identity. In many cold cases, this became the final wall investigators could not climb. The offender had never been arrested, or they had committed crimes before DNA collection was routine, or their crimes fell outside the categories that required mandatory DNA submission. In these situations, DNA could confirm what had happened, but not who had done it. This created a dangerous illusion. To the public, it appeared that science had reached its limits, that if DNA did not produce a name, then no further progress was possible. Families were told that the evidence was preserved, that technology might advance, but that there were no active leads. Over time, hope dulled into endurance. Investigators understood this frustration intimately. Many knew exactly which crimes DNA belonged to, and exactly what had occurred. They simply could not attach that knowledge to a human being. Justice stalled not because of lack of effort, but because of lack of connection. Meanwhile, offenders who had avoided arrest began to age quietly. They changed jobs, started families, moved homes. Some watched the news when their crimes were discussed, confident that they were beyond reach. The system had taught them that unless they made a mistake, time would protect them. And for many years, it did. The idea that DNA could ever identify someone without them first entering the criminal system seemed impossible. Genetics, after all, was understood as personal, not relational. It identified individuals, not families. But outside the world of law enforcement, genetics was evolving differently. Researchers were no longer focused solely on individual identification. They were studying inheritance patterns, shared genetic markers, probabilities that linked distant relatives across generations. DNA was becoming less about who you are and more about who you are connected to. This shift did not happen overnight. It grew slowly in academic papers, medical research, and ancestry studies. And for a long time, these two worlds remained separate. Police worked with crime scene DNA. Scientists worked with population genetics. The overlap had not yet been explored. Traditional forensic DNA analysis was precise, but narrow. It required certainty, a match or no match. Genetic genealogy, still unnamed at the time, would operate differently. It would accept partial answers, probabilities, shared segments that did not identify a person directly but suggested relationships. This distinction is crucial. Traditional DNA asks a yes or no question. Genetic genealogy asks a different one entirely. Who could this person be related to? That question had never been part of criminal investigation before. Because of this limitation, many cold cases sat untouched even as DNA technology improved. Better testing methods produced cleaner profiles, but the fundamental problem remained the same. Without a reference point, DNA could not speak. It waited in databases like a locked room without a key. Investigators knew the evidence was there. They simply had no way inside. This period of forensic history is often overlooked. It was a time of progress paired with frustration, of answers that stopped halfway, of technology that felt powerful but incomplete. It taught investigators an important lesson, though they did not yet know it. The problem was not the DNA itself. The problem was how narrowly it was being used. As this chapter closes, the stage is set for a quiet transformation, not driven by police departments or lawmakers at first, but by ordinary people. People curious about their ancestry. People searching for family connections. People submitting DNA not to solve crimes, but to understand where they came from. Unknowingly, they were building something far larger. A network, a map, a structure that would eventually give voice to evidence that had been silent for decades. Cold cases were no longer waiting for better DNA. They were waiting for a different way of thinking about it. For many years, the question guiding criminal investigations remained the same. Who did this? Detectives followed leads, compared evidence, and searched for a name that fit the facts. When DNA entered the picture, that question became sharper but no less rigid. Whose DNA is this? The answer was either found or it was not. And when it was not, the investigation stalled. But what eventually transformed cold cases was not a better answer to the same question. It was a completely different question altogether. Instead of asking whose DNA is this, investigators would eventually begin asking who could this person be related to. That subtle shift would change everything. At first, the idea felt almost uncomfortable. Criminal investigations had always focused on individuals. Guilt and innocence were personal. Responsibility could not be inherited. Yet genetics itself told a different story. DNA did not exist in isolation. Every person carried within them fragments of their parents, grandparents, and distant ancestors. These fragments overlapped. They repeated. They formed patterns that extended outward into families, communities, and entire populations. Scientists had long understood this, but law enforcement had never applied it in this way. The criminal justice system was built to identify individuals, not networks. This hesitation was partly ethical and partly practical. There were serious concerns about privacy. Could a person be implicated in a crime simply because a relative shared genetic material? What protections existed for people who had done nothing wrong? These questions slowed progress, and rightly so. But alongside these concerns, something else was happening. Millions of people were voluntarily submitting their DNA to consumer genealogy companies. They were not thinking about crime. They were thinking about ancestry, about family stories, about missing branches in their personal histories. Each new submission added another point to an ever-expanding genetic web. This web grew quietly. It crossed borders. It linked strangers who would never meet. And unlike law enforcement databases, it was not limited to criminals. It represented a broad slice of the population. Over time, this made the web incredibly powerful. Even if a person had never submitted their DNA, chances were increasing that someone related to them had a distant cousin, a second cousin once removed, a shared ancestor from generations back. The science did not require close relatives to work. It only required enough overlap to suggest a direction. For cold cases, this represented something entirely new. DNA no longer needed to point directly to a suspect. It only needed to point toward a family. From there, traditional investigation could take over. Geography, age, opportunity, behavior. The genetic data would not replace police work. It would guide it. And that distinction mattered. This was not a shortcut to justice. It was a map. Still, for years, this approach remained largely theoretical. Law enforcement agencies were cautious. Policies had not caught up. The technology was complex. The work required specialists who understood both genetics and genealogy. Building family trees was slow, meticulous labor. It involved public records, historical documents, and countless hours of analysis. There were no guarantees. Many paths would lead nowhere. But for the first time, cold cases had a direction that did not depend on luck. As a few pioneering investigators began to experiment with this method, the results were tentative but promising. Partial matches appeared. Family connections emerged. Names were narrowed, not confirmed, but suggested. Each success encouraged more experimentation. Each failure taught important lessons. The process demanded patience. It rewarded persistence. And most importantly, it respected the fact that evidence did not need to shout to be heard. It only needed the right listener. This shift marked the true beginning of genetic genealogy as a forensic tool, not as a replacement for traditional methods, but as an expansion of them. It acknowledged something that had always been true but rarely used: that crimes do not exist outside of human networks, that perpetrators are connected to families, histories, and communities, and that those connections, when traced carefully and ethically, could lead to answers once thought impossible. As this chapter ends, cold cases stand at the edge of transformation. They are no longer defined by silence, but by potential. Evidence that once waited for a match is now waiting for interpretation. The question has changed, and with it, the future of criminal investigation is quietly beginning to unfold. Chapter 2. From Family Trees to Crime Scenes. The idea that family history could lead to criminal answers did not originate inside police departments. It emerged quietly from a completely different place: living rooms, kitchen tables, and late-night curiosity. Ordinary people were sending saliva samples to ancestry companies, hoping to learn where their grandparents came from or why their last name appeared in a certain region centuries ago. They wanted connection, not justice. Yet every sample they submitted added another data point to a rapidly expanding genetic map of humanity. By the early 2010s, these databases had grown into something unprecedented. Millions of genetic profiles existed outside the control of law enforcement, voluntarily provided by people with no connection to crime. What made these databases powerful was not any single profile, but the relationships between them. DNA, when compared across large populations, revealed shared segments that pointed to common ancestors. Even distant relatives shared identifiable markers. This meant that an unknown person's DNA could be linked indirectly through cousins and extended family members, rather than through the person themselves. For forensic science, this realization was profound. Traditional DNA analysis treated each profile as isolated. Either it matched a known individual or it did not. Genetic genealogy treated DNA as relational. It accepted partial matches. It worked with probabilities rather than certainties. A crime scene sample did not need to match someone exactly. It only needed to match enough people loosely to suggest a family network. From there, genealogy could do the rest. Investigators could build family trees using public records such as birth certificates, marriage licenses, census data, and obituaries. These records had always existed, but they had never been combined with DNA in this way. Suddenly, Centuries of documentation became part of modern investigations. The work was slow and meticulous. There were no instant results. Genealogists often began with distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared only small percentages of DNA. Each connection required careful verification. Family trees branched outward, then collapsed back inward as lines were eliminated. Age, location, and opportunity mattered. Someone might share DNA, but be ruled out because they were too young, too old, or living thousands of miles away at the time of the crime. This process was not glamorous. It involved spreadsheets, handwritten charts, and hours of quiet research. But it worked. One of the most important aspects of this method was that it did not accuse. Genetic genealogy did not identify suspects. It identified possibilities. The DNA pointed toward families, not individuals. Traditional police work still determined guilt. This distinction helped address ethical concerns. People were not being arrested because of their relatives. They were being investigated because evidence and circumstance aligned. The genealogy merely opened doors that had previously been invisible. Early successes came quietly. Investigators solved cases that had been unsolved for decades. Victims finally received names. Families learned what had happened. These stories did not always make headlines at first, but within law enforcement, word spread quickly. A method once considered experimental was proving reliable. Agencies began forming partnerships with genealogists. Cold case units were restructured. Evidence long considered dormant was pulled from storage and re-examined. At the same time, legal and ethical frameworks began to develop. Not all genealogy databases allowed law enforcement access. Some required explicit user consent. Others restricted usage to violent crimes. Courts examined whether publicly available genetic information could be used in investigations. The consensus emerged slowly, shaped by caution and precedent. What remained clear was that this technology, when used responsibly, filled a gap that had existed for generations. This chapter marks the moment when genealogy left the family album and entered the evidence room. It represents a shift from isolated data points to interconnected histories. From single suspects to extended networks. Cold cases were no longer waiting for confessions or chance discoveries. They were being approached systematically, patiently, and scientifically. DNA had become more than identification. It had become direction. As investigators learned to navigate this new terrain, the implications grew larger. If crimes committed decades ago could be solved this way, then time itself had lost its protective power. The past was no longer unreachable. It was searchable, and the families who had unknowingly built these databases had created something extraordinary, a collective record capable of speaking for victims who had waited far too long to be heard. To understand why genetic genealogy succeeded where traditional methods failed, it helps to slow down and look closely at how DNA actually works. Not as a dramatic breakthrough, but as a quiet system of inheritance that has always existed. Every person carries two copies of their DNA, passed down from their parents. Those parents receive their DNA from their parents, and so on, stretching backward through generations. Along the way, pieces are shuffled, combined, and rearranged, but they are never completely erased. Small segments persist. These segments are the reason distant relatives can be identified even when they share only a tiny fraction of genetic material. What genetic genealogy does is recognize these shared segments and calculate the probability of a relationship. It does not say who someone is. It says how they might be connected. In practice, this process begins with a crime scene DNA profile. This profile is carefully cleaned, verified, and formatted so it can be compared against consumer genealogy databases. Unlike law enforcement databases, these platforms are designed to look for partial matches. They scan millions of profiles and return a list of people who share measurable segments of DNA with the unknown sample. Each result includes an estimate of how closely related the two individuals might be. Often, these matches are distant. Third cousins, fourth cousins, sometimes even further removed. To the untrained eye, these connections might seem useless, but to a genealogist, they are valuable starting points. From here, the work becomes deeply methodical. Genealogists begin building family trees for each match, tracing ancestors backward until they find common points where the trees intersect. This is where public records become essential. Birth records reveal parents. Marriage records link families. Census data shows who lived where and when. Obituaries list surviving relatives. Each document adds another piece to the puzzle. Slowly, overlapping family lines emerge. These overlaps suggest a shared ancestor somewhere in the past. Once that ancestor is identified, genealogists trace the family forward again, following every branch down to the present day. At this stage, the tree can become very large. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of descendants may appear. Most of them are quickly ruled out. Some are the wrong age. Some lived in different regions. Some are women when the suspect is known to be male. Others were too young or too old at the time of the crime. What remains is a narrowing group of individuals who fit both the genetic data and the known facts of the case. This process can take months, sometimes years. It requires patience and precision. One incorrect assumption can send the entire investigation in the wrong direction. What makes this approach powerful is not speed, but accumulation. Each small elimination strengthens what remains. The DNA does not accuse anyone. It simply points toward a family network. Traditional investigative work then takes over. Detectives examine employment records, military service, criminal history, and geographic movement. They compare timelines. They revisit witness statements. They look for behavioral patterns that align with the crime. Only when all of these elements converge does a suspect truly emerge. Importantly, confirmation still requires a direct DNA match. Investigators do not rely on genealogy alone. Once a potential suspect is identified, law enforcement must obtain their DNA legally, often through discarded items like cups, tissues, or trash left in public spaces. This DNA is then compared directly to the crime scene evidence. Only when that match is confirmed does the case move forward. In this way, genetic genealogy acts as a guide, not a verdict. This layered process addresses one of the biggest concerns surrounding the technology. It is not about guilt by association. It is about narrowing the field in a responsible, evidence-based way. Many people share DNA. Only one person committed the crime. Genetic genealogy helps investigators move from millions of possibilities to a manageable number, where traditional standards of proof can be applied. As this method became more widely understood, it reshaped investigative strategy. Cold cases were no longer reopened randomly. They were selected based on whether usable DNA existed. Agencies invested in preserving biological evidence more carefully. Training programs were developed to teach detectives how to work alongside genealogists. A new hybrid discipline emerged, blending science, history, and police work into a single process. This chapter of the story reveals something essential. DNA alone does not solve crimes. People do. Scientists, genealogists, investigators, and analysts working together over long periods of time. Genetic genealogy did not replace human judgment. It amplified it. It turned DNA into a map, but humans still had to choose which paths to follow. And as investigators grew more confident in reading this map, a realization settled in. If DNA could lead backward through generations to find one offender, it could do the same for many others. Cold cases were no longer isolated mysteries. They were connected by a shared truth. That time does not erase genetic evidence. It only waits for the right method to uncover it. As genetic genealogy moved from theory into practice, investigators began to realize that its true strength was not certainty, but probability. Traditional criminal investigations were built on absolutes. A fingerprint either matched or it did not. A witness either identified a suspect or failed to do so. DNA profiles either aligned perfectly or produced no result at all. Genetic genealogy operated in a different space entirely. It accepted uncertainty as part of the process. Instead of asking for exact answers, it asked better questions. How likely is this relationship? How many generations separate these individuals? Which branches of this family could plausibly intersect with the crime? This probabilistic thinking marked a fundamental shift in how cases were approached. At first, this shift made many investigators uneasy. Law enforcement had been trained to seek definitive proof at every stage. Probability felt vague. It required patience and tolerance for ambiguity. But as cases progressed, detectives began to understand that probability did not weaken investigations. It strengthened them. Each probability narrowed the field. Each elimination reduced noise. What remained grew sharper over time. Genetic genealogy did not offer a single breakthrough moment. It offered a gradual convergence, a slow tightening of focus until one possibility stood alone. This approach was especially effective in cases where offenders had lived quietly after their crimes. These individuals had no criminal records. They did not appear in databases. They blended into society, relying on anonymity rather than violence to protect themselves. Traditional policing had no way to reach them. But genetic genealogy did not care about behavior after the fact. It cared about biology. It followed inheritance patterns that could not be altered or erased. No matter how carefully someone lived, they could not change who they were related to. As more cases were solved, a pattern emerged. Many offenders were not hiding in distant places. They were nearby. They lived ordinary lives. They had families, jobs, and routines. This realization was unsettling, not because it suggested danger everywhere, but because it revealed how incomplete earlier investigative tools had been. The absence of arrest had never meant the absence of a perpetrator. It had only meant the absence of connection. With each successful case, confidence grew. Investigators refined their methods. They learned which databases were most useful, how to prioritize matches, and how to avoid common errors in tree building. Standards were developed. Peer review became common. Genealogists cross-checked one another's work. Mistakes were acknowledged and corrected. The field matured quickly, driven by responsibility as much as success. At the same time, conversations about ethics intensified. Genetic genealogy forced society to confront difficult questions. What does consent mean when DNA reveals information about relatives? Should people be able to opt out entirely? How should data be protected? These discussions were not obstacles. They were necessary safeguards. Most agencies adopted strict rules. Genetic genealogy was limited to serious violent crimes. Access to databases required transparency. Investigators documented every step. Oversight became part of the process. One of the most important outcomes of this era was trust. Trust between scientists and law enforcement. Trust between investigators and the public. And trust that this powerful tool would not be used recklessly. Cases solved through genetic genealogy were often accompanied by careful explanations, not dramatic announcements. The emphasis was on method, not spectacle. This period also revealed something deeper about time and justice. Cold cases were no longer defined by how long they had remained unsolved. A case from 40 years ago could now be more solvable than one from last year, depending on the evidence preserved. Time stopped being an enemy and became a neutral factor. The past was no longer inaccessible. It was simply waiting for interpretation. As this chapter closes, genetic genealogy stands fully formed. No longer experimental. No longer controversial in principle. It is understood as a tool that works best when used carefully, collaboratively, and ethically. It does not replace traditional investigation. It enhances it. It does not rush toward answers. It builds toward them. What began as curiosity about family history had become a force capable of reshaping justice itself. DNA, once limited to confirming identities, now traced paths through generations. Probability had become power, and cold cases, once resigned to silence, had gained a new voice, one that spoke softly, patiently, and with extraordinary reach. Chapter 3. The First Doors That Opened. When genetic genealogy first crossed from theory into real investigations, it did not arrive with confidence. It arrived with hesitation. The earliest cases chosen for this method were ones investigators believed had nothing left to lose. Files that had been reopened too many times. Evidence that had been tested with every available technique. Families who had already been told, gently and repeatedly, that answers might never come. These were the cases where silence had lasted so long that even a small possibility felt worth the risk. What investigators did not yet realize was that they were standing at the edge of a fundamental shift in how justice could function across time. The earliest applications of forensic genetic genealogy were painstakingly slow. There were no established workflows, no specialized units, no shared best practices. Every step had to be invented, tested, and often corrected. Genealogists worked alongside detectives, learning one another's languages. Scientists spoke in centimorgans and shared segments. Investigators spoke in timelines, alibis, and opportunity. It took time for these worlds to align, but when they did, the results were unmistakable. Names began to surface in cases that had been dormant for decades. Not confessions, not accusations, just names that fit the genetic and historical record better than any others. One of the most striking aspects of these early successes was how ordinary they felt. The people identified were not hiding in remote locations. They were not living under assumed identities. They were often employed, married, and deeply embedded in their communities. Some had grandchildren. Some volunteered. Some had never been questioned by police in their lives. This ordinariness unsettled investigators. It challenged long-held assumptions about criminal behavior. The absence of arrest had always been interpreted as absence of threat. Genetic genealogy revealed something different. That some offenders simply aged out of attention, protected not by skill, but by time. As the first cases were solved, the emotional impact rippled outward. Families who had waited decades were contacted cautiously. Detectives knew these moments could not be rushed. Answers did not arrive cleanly. They came with grief, shock, and sometimes disbelief. But they also came with clarity. A name, a narrative that made sense of years of uncertainty. In many cases, families described a strange combination of relief and sorrow. Relief that the waiting had ended. Sorrow that it had taken so long. These reactions reinforced the responsibility investigators felt when using this technology. Solving a case was not an endpoint. It was the beginning of a new phase of understanding. Inside law enforcement, the reaction was swift but measured. Cold case units across the country began reviewing their inventories. Which cases had viable DNA? Which evidence had been preserved properly? Which investigations might benefit from genealogical analysis? Training programs were developed. Funding was redirected. Partnerships formed between police departments and independent genealogists. What had started as an experiment was becoming infrastructure. Genetic genealogy was no longer an exception. It was becoming an option. At the same time, the justice system moved carefully. Prosecutors examined whether cases solved through genealogical methods would withstand scrutiny in court. Defense attorneys raised questions about methodology. Judges requested clear explanations. This scrutiny strengthened the process. Standards became clearer. Documentation became more rigorous. Every assumption had to be supported. Every step had to be traceable. In this way, genetic genealogy matured quickly, shaped by both success and skepticism. What made this chapter distinct was not just the cases solved, but the shift in mindset. Investigators began to see cold cases not as static failures, but as evolving puzzles. Evidence once considered exhausted was reclassified as dormant, waiting for the right context. waiting for the right tools, waiting for someone to ask a different question. Genetic genealogy did not promise immediate answers. It promised possibility. And in doing so, it restored something many investigators had quietly lost over the years: hope grounded in method. As the first doors opened, others followed. Each solved case added confidence. Each confirmed match strengthened trust in the process. The idea that justice had an expiration date began to erode. Time was no longer the final barrier. It was simply another variable to be accounted for. This chapter marks the moment when genetic genealogy stopped being a risk and became a responsibility. A responsibility to revisit the past with new care, to speak for evidence that had waited patiently, and to acknowledge that silence, no matter how long it lasts, is not the same as resolution. As more cases were approached through genetic genealogy, investigators began to notice patterns that had been invisible before. Not patterns of violence alone, but patterns of movement, timing, and opportunity that only became clear when multiple cases were viewed through the same lens. What once appeared as isolated crimes now suggested broader narratives. Offenders who had been active across jurisdictions were no longer confined to a single police department's files. Family trees did not stop at city limits. DNA did not recognize county borders. And as genealogical methods connected distant relatives across regions, crimes that had never been linked began to align in unexpected ways. This shift forced law enforcement to confront a long-standing structural limitation. Traditional policing had been organized geographically. Cities, counties, and states worked within their own boundaries, sharing information only when obvious connections existed. Genetic genealogy quietly dismantled those boundaries. A crime in one state could be linked to a suspect family in another. A series of offenses once believed to be unrelated could now be examined together. Investigators who had never spoken to one another found themselves collaborating across decades and jurisdictions, guided not by hunches, but by shared genetic data. With these connections came a deeper understanding of offender behavior. Many individuals identified through genetic genealogy had followed consistent patterns over time. They committed crimes within specific age ranges. They targeted certain environments. They moved in ways that reflected employment, family obligations, or military service. When investigators overlaid genetic leads with behavioral analysis, a more complete picture emerged. The offender was no longer an abstraction. He became a person shaped by circumstance, access, and opportunity. This did not excuse the crimes. It contextualized them, and context made prevention possible. The emergence of these patterns also reshaped how cold cases were prioritized. Investigators learned that not all unsolved cases benefited equally from genealogical methods. Cases with degraded or mixed DNA posed challenges. Others lacked sufficient genetic material altogether. But where viable DNA existed, especially from violent crimes, the potential was significant. Agencies began cataloging evidence more systematically, preserving samples with future testing in mind. The question shifted from whether a case could be solved now to whether it could be solved eventually. Behind the scenes, the work remained quiet and exacting. Genealogists refined their techniques, learning how to interpret small shared segments and how to avoid false assumptions. They developed strategies for dealing with endogamy, where populations share higher than average genetic overlap. They learned to recognize when a match suggested a recent relationship versus a distant one. Each refinement reduced error and increased confidence. This was not a static method. It evolved with every case. As confidence grew, so did responsibility. Investigators became acutely aware of the human impact of their work. Each name uncovered represented not only a suspect, but a family that would be affected by the truth. Notifications were handled carefully. Arrests were planned with sensitivity. Public announcements avoided sensational language. The goal was not to shock, but to inform. Many agencies emphasized transparency, explaining how genetic genealogy worked and why it was used. This openness helped maintain public trust and reinforce the ethical foundation of the method. The ripple effects extended beyond law enforcement. Media coverage began to shift. Instead of focusing solely on the crimes themselves, stories highlighted the science and collaboration behind the solutions. Educational institutions incorporated genetic genealogy into forensic programs. Legal scholars examined its implications. Policy makers debated regulation. What had started as a quiet experiment was now influencing multiple fields at once. Perhaps the most significant change was psychological. For investigators who had spent years revisiting the same unanswered questions, genetic genealogy offered something rare: momentum. Cases moved forward not because of luck, but because of process. Each step built on the last. Even when a lead did not pan out, the work contributed to a growing body of knowledge. Failure was informative. Progress was cumulative. This period marked the transition from isolated success stories to a sustained investigative strategy. Genetic genealogy was no longer defined by a single breakthrough. It was defined by consistency, by repeatable results, by the recognition that evidence preserved long enough would eventually find its voice. As patterns continued to emerge, one truth became increasingly difficult to ignore. The crimes of the past were not buried. They were archived, and with the right tools, archives could be read. Not quickly, not easily, but clearly enough to change how justice understood time, connection, and accountability. The door that had opened once was now held wide, and through it, investigators stepped with greater confidence, carrying with them the knowledge that silence, no matter how enduring, was no longer absolute. Genetic genealogy continued to prove its value. Something subtle but profound changed inside police departments and forensic units. Cold cases were no longer treated as historical artifacts, reminders of what could not be solved. They began to feel alive again, not urgent in the way of breaking news, but active in a quieter sense. Evidence was no longer static. It was waiting, and investigators began to understand that every preserved sample carried future potential, even if the technology to unlock it did not yet exist. This realization reshaped how law enforcement thought about time. Previously, a case that went unsolved for 10 or 20 years was often considered functionally closed, even if it remained technically open. Witnesses were gone, leads exhausted, momentum lost. Genetic genealogy disrupted that finality. It introduced the idea that a case could reawaken not because of new behavior by a suspect, but because of new knowledge in the world. A crime committed decades ago could suddenly intersect with a database created for entirely different reasons. The past was no longer isolated from the present. It was connected to it. Investigators also began to notice how this method altered offender psychology. For years, some criminals had believed that avoiding arrest early was equivalent to escaping justice entirely. If they were never fingerprinted, never convicted, never placed into a database, they assumed they were invisible. Genetic genealogy shattered that assumption. It revealed that no one exists in isolation. Everyone is part of a family, a lineage, a genetic network that extends outward regardless of personal choices. Offenders could control their own behavior, but they could not control who their relatives were or what decisions those relatives might make decades later. This shift had a preventative dimension as well. Law enforcement agencies began to communicate openly about the capabilities of genetic genealogy, not as a threat, but as a fact. Crimes once thought impossible to solve were now being resolved. The message was subtle but clear. Time was no longer a reliable shield. Accountability could arrive slowly, but it could arrive all the same. This understanding began influencing investigative strategies, sentencing discussions, and even public awareness campaigns. At the same time, agencies became more deliberate about which cases to pursue using genealogical methods. Not every case was appropriate. Not every DNA sample was viable. Standards were refined. Violent crimes were prioritized. Consent policies were respected. Oversight committees reviewed usage. The goal was not to apply the method broadly, but responsibly. Genetic genealogy was powerful precisely because it was rare, careful, and focused. For families of victims, this era brought a new kind of waiting, one that felt different from before. Instead of being told there was nothing left to do, they were told the case remained active in a different way. Evidence was preserved. Databases were growing. Technology was advancing. Hope became quieter, but steadier. Many families described a strange sense of suspended motion, not closure, but movement. The possibility that answers could still emerge, even if the timing was uncertain. Inside forensic labs, protocols evolved. Biological evidence was handled with new care. Preservation became paramount. What once might have been considered insufficient was now stored, cataloged, and protected. Lab technicians understood that even partial profiles could become valuable in the future. The mindset shifted from immediate usefulness to long-term potential. Evidence was no longer judged solely by what it could reveal today, but by what it might reveal years from now. This long view extended into training and education. New generations of investigators were taught not just how to solve cases, but how to think across time. They learned that investigation was not always about speed. Sometimes it was about patience, about documentation, about leaving a clear trail for those who might return to the case later with better tools. Genetic genealogy reinforced the idea that justice could be collaborative across generations. What made this moment remarkable was its quietness. There were no sweeping reforms announced overnight, no single law that transformed everything. Change arrived incrementally, case by case, database by database, success by success. And yet, taken together, these changes marked a fundamental redefinition of what it meant for a case to be unsolved. Cold cases were no longer frozen. They were dormant, waiting for context, waiting for connection, waiting for the right convergence of science, data, and human effort. Genetic genealogy did not promise answers for every crime. It promised something more realistic and more powerful, that no case had to remain untouched forever. That evidence, if respected and preserved, retained its voice. And that time, once feared as the enemy of justice, could become its ally. As this chapter closes, the transformation is complete. Cold cases are no longer the end of the investigative road. They are simply part of a longer journey, one that does not rush, one that listens, and one that trusts that even after decades of silence, the truth is capable of finding its way forward. Chapter 4. The Case That Changed Everything. There are moments in criminal history when progress does not arrive gradually, but crystallizes around a single case. Not because it was the first, but because it made the consequences impossible to ignore. For genetic genealogy, that moment came when a long-feared, long-mythologized offender was finally identified after decades of silence. Until then, the method had produced results quietly, case by case, often known only within investigative circles. But this case was different. It carried scale. It carried public memory. And when it was solved, it forced the world to pay attention not just to the outcome, but to the method that made it possible. For years, the offender had existed as a collection of names and aliases. He was known by different titles depending on the region, the era, and the crimes attributed to him. Communities remembered fear without resolution. Investigators remembered frustration without answers. Survivors carried questions that never faded. Traditional investigative tools had been exhausted. The crimes spanned jurisdictions. The offender had stopped. Time had passed. Many believed the case would remain unresolved forever. And yet, preserved within evidence boxes, there was DNA. Silent. Anonymous. Waiting. When investigators decided to apply genetic genealogy to this case, they did so cautiously. They understood the visibility of what they were attempting. This was not a trial run. It was a test with enormous implications. The DNA was uploaded into an open-source genealogy database. one that allowed users to compare profiles and find relatives. The result was not immediate clarity, but a familiar pattern: distant matches, partial overlaps, the faint outlines of family connections that suggested direction without certainty. Genealogists began building trees, tracing lines backward and forward, eliminating impossibilities, narrowing possibilities. What emerged was not a dramatic revelation, but a convergence. Multiple family lines pointed toward a small group of individuals who fit the known facts: age, geography, opportunity, background. One name began to align too closely to ignore, not because of a criminal record, not because of suspicion, but because everything else had fallen away. Traditional police work resumed quietly. Surveillance, background checks, routine observation, and eventually, a legally obtained DNA sample confirmed what genealogy had suggested. The anonymous DNA had a name. The arrest that followed did not feel like a spectacle. It felt restrained, almost anticlimactic. A man in his later years was taken into custody. Neighbors expressed disbelief. The public struggled to reconcile the image of an ordinary life with the weight of what had been uncovered. For survivors and families, the moment was complex. Relief arrived alongside grief. Closure did not erase the past. It reframed it. What mattered most was not the arrest itself, but what it represented. For the first time, genetic genealogy had solved a case that defined an era of fear. It demonstrated, unequivocally, that this method was not limited to obscure investigations. It could reach into the most notorious corners of criminal history and pull truth forward. The implications were immediate and far-reaching. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reassessing unsolved cases. Cold case units expanded. Funding was allocated. Policies were drafted. The question was no longer whether genetic genealogy worked. The question was how responsibly it could be scaled. This case also forced a public reckoning with privacy and consent. People began asking how their DNA could be used, and whether participation in genealogy databases carried unintended consequences. These conversations were necessary. They shaped how the technology would move forward. Many databases clarified their policies. Some restricted law enforcement access. Others required explicit opt-in consent. Oversight increased. Transparency became essential. Yet, even amid debate, the shift could not be undone. The case had proven that time did not guarantee anonymity, that evidence preserved with care could outlast strategy and secrecy, that science, when paired with patience, could reach across decades. Genetic genealogy had crossed a threshold. It was no longer an experimental tool. It was a defining force. As this chapter begins, the story moves beyond possibility into permanence. The technology that solved this case would now influence hundreds of others. Investigators would return to archives with renewed purpose. Families would receive calls they never expected. And the justice system would continue adapting to a reality where the past was no longer unreachable. This was the moment the world understood that genetic genealogy had changed the rules. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. In the months following that landmark arrest, the effects moved outward in slow, deliberate waves. Inside law enforcement, there was no celebration. There was recalibration. Investigators understood that a door had opened, but walking through it responsibly required restraint. Genetic genealogy was powerful precisely because it worked quietly, and many agencies were determined not to damage public trust by moving too fast or without clear boundaries. Meetings were held. Protocols were drafted. Legal teams reviewed procedures line by line. What had begun as an innovative solution for a single case was now being shaped into a disciplined investigative practice. Cold case units across the country began inventorying their evidence with renewed attention. Boxes that had not been opened in years were re-examined. Lab technicians assessed which samples still held usable genetic material. Some cases advanced immediately. Others required reprocessing, careful cleaning, or additional testing. In many instances, the evidence had been preserved well enough to allow modern analysis. In others, time had taken its toll. These moments reinforced a critical lesson. Preservation mattered. How evidence was handled decades earlier now determined whether answers were possible today. As agencies prioritized cases, a pattern emerged. Genetic genealogy proved most effective for violent crimes where DNA was clearly attributable to a single offender. Homicides, sexual assaults, cases with clear biological evidence left behind. These constraints were intentional. Investigators and policymakers agreed that the method should be reserved for the most serious crimes, both to protect civil liberties and to maintain public confidence. This was not a tool for broad surveillance. It was a targeted response to profound harm. Alongside these practical developments, conversations intensified outside law enforcement. Privacy advocates, ethicists, and legal scholars examined what this new capability meant for society. The questions were complex. When someone uploaded their DNA to learn about ancestry, did they implicitly consent to law enforcement use? Could one person's choice expose information about relatives who never agreed? How should consent be defined when genetic data is inherently shared? These debates were not obstacles. They were part of the maturation process. Technology often advances faster than the frameworks that govern it, and genetic genealogy was no exception. In response, many genealogy databases clarified their policies. Some restricted law enforcement access entirely. Others allowed it only under strict conditions, such as violent crimes and with warrants or court orders. Opt-in systems were created. Transparency reports were published. The goal was balance, to allow justice to move forward without eroding trust, to ensure that the method remained a tool of accountability, not intrusion. For investigators, this period required a new kind of discipline. Genetic genealogy could not replace careful police work. It demanded it. Every step had to be documented, every assumption tested. Family trees were built conservatively, with corroboration at each stage. Genealogists worked in pairs or teams, cross-checking one another's conclusions. Mistakes were acknowledged and corrected. The method's credibility depended on humility as much as accuracy. Meanwhile, families of victims began receiving unexpected calls. Some had waited decades. Some had learned to live without answers. Investigators approached these conversations carefully, aware that reopening a case could reopen wounds. In many instances, families expressed cautious hope rather than celebration. They wanted truth, not spectacle. And as cases progressed, that truth arrived unevenly. Some received names. Others received explanations. Some received confirmation of long-held suspicions. Each outcome was different, but all shared a common thread. Movement. The sense that the story had not ended in silence. This period also reshaped training and collaboration. Police departments partnered with academic institutions. Forensic programs introduced coursework on genetic genealogy. Conferences brought together detectives, scientists, and genealogists to share lessons learned. What emerged was a hybrid discipline that valued both precision and patience. The work required understanding statistics and human behavior, biology, and bureaucracy. It rewarded careful thinking over quick conclusions. As more cases moved forward, public understanding evolved. Media coverage became more nuanced. Rather than focusing solely on the shock of identification, stories explained the process. How distant relatives led to family trees. How probability guided investigation. How confirmation required direct DNA matches and legal safeguards. This education mattered. It replaced fear with comprehension. It reinforced that genetic genealogy was not magic. It was method. The aftermath of the breakthrough did not produce a rush of arrests. It produced a recalibrated justice system, one that recognized the power of connection, one that understood the responsibility that came with new tools, and one that accepted that progress, when done carefully, does not need to be loud to be lasting. As this chapter continues, the focus shifts from a single transformative case to a broader question. What does justice look like when time no longer protects anonymity, when evidence does not expire, and when the past can be revisited not with desperation, but with clarity? Genetic genealogy had crossed into permanence. The task now was to carry it forward with care. As genetic genealogy became an established investigative tool, the conversation surrounding it began to change. The question was no longer whether it could solve cases, but how it should be used. Success had brought visibility, and visibility brought responsibility. Investigators understood that every breakthrough carried consequences beyond the case itself. Each use of genetic genealogy shaped public trust, legal precedent, and the future boundaries of forensic science. The technology had proven its power. Now it needed restraint. Law enforcement agencies began formalizing policies that emphasized caution. Genetic genealogy would not be used for minor crimes. It would not be used for fishing expeditions. It would not replace traditional investigation. Instead, it would serve as a final option, reserved for cases involving severe harm and exhausted leads. This principle became central to its legitimacy. By limiting its scope, agencies reinforced that the method existed to serve justice, not convenience. Oversight structures followed. Requests to use genetic genealogy were reviewed by supervisors, legal teams, and sometimes independent committees. Investigators were required to document why other methods had failed and why genealogical analysis was appropriate. This process slowed investigations deliberately. It ensured that the decision to use such a powerful tool was thoughtful, not reactive. In a field often driven by urgency, this measured pace was a significant shift. The responsibility also extended to how results were interpreted. Early successes had shown how easy it was to misread genetic data without context. A shared DNA segment could suggest a relationship, but not motive, opportunity, or guilt. Investigators learned to treat genetic leads as fragile threads, not conclusions. Every genealogical suggestion required corroboration through records, timelines, and behavior. This insistence on confirmation protected both suspects and the integrity of the cases themselves. At the same time, public awareness grew. People began to understand that submitting DNA for ancestry testing carried implications beyond personal curiosity. For some, this realization caused discomfort. For others, it brought a sense of contribution. Many expressed willingness to help solve violent crimes, even indirectly. Databases responded by improving consent mechanisms, allowing users to choose how their data could be used. Transparency became central. Trust was no longer assumed. It had to be earned. This era also brought humility. Investigators acknowledged that genetic genealogy was not a universal solution. Some cases lacked usable DNA. Others involved degraded samples that could not produce reliable profiles. In some investigations, genealogical leads ended in dead ends. These outcomes were not failures. They were reminders that science had limits, and that respecting those limits was part of ethical practice. Genetic genealogy did not guarantee answers. It offered opportunity. Perhaps the most meaningful responsibility was toward the families of victims. Solving a case decades later did not restore what was lost. It did not rewind time. Investigators learned to approach these moments with care, understanding that closure is not a single emotion. It can be relief and grief at the same time. Some families welcomed the truth. Others struggled with its arrival after so many years. Genetic genealogy forced justice to move gently, honoring the complexity of human response. As policies matured, a balance emerged. Genetic genealogy became neither feared nor idolized. It settled into its role as one tool among many. Powerful, but not dominant. Transformative, but not reckless. Its success depended not only on science, but on the discipline of those who used it. This balance ensured its longevity. By this point, the field had crossed a threshold. Genetic genealogy was no longer defined by its first successes. It was defined by how responsibly it was applied afterward. The justice system had learned that innovation without restraint risks harm, but innovation guided by principle can endure. This chapter closes on a quiet truth. Technology does not define justice. People do. Genetic genealogy did not change the moral foundation of criminal investigation. It reinforced it. That evidence deserves respect. That victims deserve care. And that power, when used thoughtfully, can illuminate the past without repeating its mistakes. The work continued. Patient, deliberate, and always aware that the greatest breakthroughs carry the greatest responsibility. Chapter 5. The Science Behind the Breakthrough. To truly understand why genetic genealogy changed criminal investigations so completely, it is important to step away from the courtroom and into the science itself. Not the headlines, not the arrests, but the quiet biological rules that govern every human life. DNA is not a code written once and sealed. It is copied, divided, and passed down endlessly, generation after generation. Each person inherits half of their DNA from their mother and half from their father. Those halves are themselves mixtures, shaped by countless ancestors before them. Over time, this creates a complex mosaic of shared genetic material, scattered unevenly across families and populations. Genetic genealogy works because these fragments persist, even when names, memories, and records disappear. At the core of this science is the concept of shared DNA segments. When two people share a segment of DNA, it means they inherited that segment from a common ancestor. The length and number of these shared segments help determine how closely related two individuals might be. Close relatives share many long segments. Distant relatives share fewer, shorter ones. These measurements are not guesses. They are calculated using statistical models refined through decades of population genetics research. When a genealogy database compares two DNA profiles, it does not simply look for identical sequences. It analyzes how much genetic material overlaps and estimates the most likely relationship based on known inheritance patterns. In forensic genetic genealogy, investigators begin with a DNA profile recovered from a crime scene. This profile is carefully prepared so it can be compared to consumer genealogy databases, which operate differently from law enforcement systems. Unlike criminal databases that look for exact matches, genealogy platforms are designed to identify partial overlaps. They return lists of people who share measurable segments of DNA with the unknown sample, along with estimates of how closely related they might be. These estimates are expressed in probabilities, not certainties. This is where the science requires interpretation rather than automation. Once matches are identified, genealogists begin reconstructing family trees. This step is as important as the DNA itself. Genetic data provides direction, but records provide structure. Birth certificates establish parentage. Marriage records connect families. Census data reveals where people lived at specific points in time. Obituaries list relatives across generations. Each document anchors the genetic information to real lives. Without this historical context, DNA alone would remain abstract. Together, genetics and records form a narrative that can be traced forward toward the present. This process requires discipline. It is easy to misinterpret genetic data if assumptions are made too quickly. Shared DNA does not always mean recent relationship. Certain populations have higher levels of genetic overlap due to historical isolation or endogamy. Genealogists must account for these factors, adjusting their expectations and calculations accordingly. Mistakes are possible. That is why verification is essential. Trees are built conservatively, with each connection supported by documentation. When uncertainty arises, branches are paused rather than forced. What makes this science so powerful in criminal investigations is not that it identifies suspects directly, but that it narrows the field logically. From millions of people, The genetic data points toward a few families. From those families, traditional investigative criteria apply: age, location, opportunity, behavior. The science does not replace police work. It guides it. This partnership between biology and investigation is what makes genetic genealogy effective and defensible. Another critical aspect of the science is confirmation. Genetic genealogy alone is never sufficient for arrest or prosecution. Once a potential suspect is identified, law enforcement must obtain a direct DNA sample legally and ethically. This sample is then compared directly to the crime scene DNA using traditional forensic methods. Only an exact match confirms identity. This safeguard ensures that probability never replaces proof. The genealogical work leads investigators to the door. Science confirms who opened it. Behind the scenes, laboratories play a crucial role. DNA samples from cold cases are often degraded or limited. Advances in sequencing technology allow scientists to extract usable data from smaller, older samples than ever before. This capability continues to improve, expanding the range of cases that can benefit from genetic genealogy. Each technological advancement increases the voice of evidence once thought silent. What this chapter reveals is that the breakthrough was never magic. It was method. Genetic genealogy succeeded because it respected complexity. It acknowledged uncertainty. It combined biology, history, and investigation into a single, patient process. The science did not promise speed. It promised direction. As this chapter opens, the focus shifts from what genetic genealogy does to how it continues to evolve. The technology is not finished. The databases are growing. The methods are refining. And with each refinement, the ability to read the past becomes clearer. DNA, once limited to confirming identity, has become a language of connection, one that speaks across time, quietly and precisely, waiting only for someone willing to listen. One of the most counterintuitive truths about genetic genealogy is that time does not diminish its power. In many ways, time strengthens it. Traditional investigations weaken as years pass. Witnesses forget details. Memories blur. People move, change names, or die. Physical evidence can degrade. Leads disappear. But genetic genealogy operates under a different logic. The passage of time does not erase DNA. It multiplies its connections. Every year that passes adds more people to genealogy databases. More descendants. More relatives. More overlapping genetic pathways. What once produced no meaningful matches can suddenly produce dozens. This is why some of the oldest cases are now among the most solvable. When a crime occurred decades ago, the offender's parents, siblings, cousins, and extended relatives have since had children and grandchildren. Each of those individuals carries fragments of shared DNA. Each new generation increases the chances that someone, somewhere, will submit their genetic profile to a public database. The original offender does not need to participate. They never did. Time does the work for investigators by expanding the genetic footprint around them. This principle explains why genetic genealogy is uniquely suited to cold cases. A crime committed in the 1970s may be more solvable today than it was in the 1990s or early 2000s. At that time, databases were small. Participation was limited. The genetic web was sparse. Today, that web is dense. Millions of profiles create a lattice of connection that makes anonymity increasingly difficult to maintain. This is not because people are being watched, but because people are choosing to connect, to learn about their ancestry, their health, their identity. Justice benefits indirectly from this collective curiosity. Investigators began to recognize this pattern early on. Cases that had produced no genealogical leads one year suddenly yielded viable matches the next. The same DNA profile, unchanged, began returning different results as databases grew. This dynamic shifted investigative strategy. Instead of exhausting a genealogical search once and moving on, agencies began revisiting cases periodically. A search that failed before might succeed later. Evidence was no longer a one-time opportunity. It became something that could be re-examined as the world around it changed. This temporal advantage also altered how offenders were perceived. Many criminals relied on time as protection. They believed that surviving the immediate aftermath of a crime meant permanent escape. Genetic genealogy undermined that belief quietly and thoroughly. It revealed that justice does not operate on the same timeline as fear. An offender could live undetected for decades, believing they were safe, only to be identified late in life through relatives they never considered relevant. Time stopped being a shield. It became a liability. From a scientific perspective, this phenomenon is rooted in inheritance patterns. DNA does not dilute into nothingness. While segments become smaller over generations, they remain detectable. Modern algorithms are capable of identifying these small shared segments with increasing precision. Improvements in computational power and statistical modeling have enhanced the sensitivity of genealogical analysis. This means that even distant relationships can now be recognized and interpreted meaningfully. What once looked like noise now carries information. This reality has profound implications for evidence preservation. Investigators now understand that biological evidence should be preserved indefinitely when possible. A sample that produces no useful results today may be invaluable in the future. This understanding has changed how evidence rooms operate, how labs prioritize testing, and how cold cases are documented. The future is no longer abstract. It is part of the investigative plan. Time also affects public understanding. As genetic genealogy has become more visible, awareness has grown. People are more informed about how DNA can be used. Consent mechanisms have become clearer. Discussions about ethics have matured. This broader understanding supports responsible use. When people know how their data may contribute to justice, trust becomes easier to maintain. Transparency transforms uncertainty into participation. What emerges from this chapter is a reversal of expectations. Time, once the enemy of justice, becomes its ally. The longer a case remains unsolved, the more opportunity exists for genetic connections to appear. Silence does not close doors. It allows networks to form. This does not mean every cold case will be solved. Limits remain. Evidence must exist. DNA must be recoverable. Databases must be accessible. But the fundamental equation has changed. Waiting is no longer passive. It is strategic. Investigators no longer fear the passage of years. They plan for it. As this chapter continues, the focus shifts to the people behind the science. The genealogists, analysts, and investigators who spend countless hours tracing lines through time. Their work is not dramatic. It is patient. It requires trust in a process that unfolds slowly. But it rests on a powerful truth. That history leaves marks. And that those marks, preserved in DNA, grow more visible as time moves forward. As genetic genealogy continued to mature, its impact reached beyond individual cases and into the collective understanding of justice itself. Investigators began to confront a reality that was both hopeful and unsettling. The past was no longer fixed. Crimes once considered sealed by time could now resurface, not because of new witnesses or confessions, but because the biological record persisted. This realization altered how society thought about accountability. It suggested that some actions do not fade. They wait. One of the most striking consequences of this shift was the emotional weight it carried for offenders who had lived quietly for decades. Many had built lives after their crimes. They had families, careers, routines. Some believed they had outgrown their past. Genetic genealogy disrupted that belief without warning. Identification often came late in life, when physical decline replaced the confidence of youth. Arrests were not scenes of pursuit, but moments of recognition. A knock at the door, a request for a DNA sample, a confirmation that the past had not forgotten. This late-stage accountability raised difficult questions. Was justice delayed still justice? Could closure arrive after so much time? For families of victims, the answers varied. Some felt relief. Others felt grief intensified by the years lost. But almost all expressed one shared sentiment. Knowing was better than not knowing. Genetic genealogy did not restore what had been taken, but it ended uncertainty. It replaced endless wondering with truth. From a legal standpoint, these cases tested the resilience of the justice system. Prosecutors built cases around evidence that was decades old. Memories had faded. Witnesses were unavailable. The strength of these prosecutions depended heavily on documentation and forensic confirmation. Genetic genealogy led investigators to suspects, but traditional DNA testing still carried the burden of proof. Courts examined these cases carefully. In doing so, they affirmed an important principle: that the passage of time does not invalidate evidence. It challenges it, but does not erase it. As more cases reached courtrooms, genetic genealogy gained legitimacy not through novelty, but through consistency. Judges recognized that the method did not replace existing standards. It operated within them. Defense attorneys scrutinized procedures, ensuring safeguards were followed. This adversarial testing strengthened the process. Each upheld conviction reinforced that the technology could withstand legal scrutiny when used responsibly. Outside the courtroom, the cultural impact grew. Documentaries, articles, and educational programs began explaining how genetic genealogy worked. Public understanding shifted from fear of surveillance to appreciation of method. The narrative moved away from technology as threat and toward technology as tool, a means of honoring victims rather than invading privacy. This shift mattered. It shaped policy decisions and database participation. Transparency proved to be the bridge between innovation and trust. For investigators, genetic genealogy changed how they viewed unresolved cases. They no longer saw age as an endpoint. They saw it as a variable. Some cases required immediate action. Others benefited from waiting. Evidence was re-examined periodically, not because something had changed in the case, but because something had changed in the world. New DNA submissions, improved algorithms, expanded records. The investigation became dynamic across time. This evolution also influenced how law enforcement approached prevention. The knowledge that crimes could be solved decades later altered risk calculations. Offenders could no longer rely on obscurity. The belief that anonymity increased with age was undermined. This did not eliminate crime, but it altered its perceived calculus. Accountability was no longer bounded by immediate consequences. It extended indefinitely. What this chapter ultimately reveals is a redefinition of closure. Closure is not forgetting. It is understanding. Genetic genealogy offered understanding where silence had reigned. It connected victims to answers, investigators to evidence, and society to a deeper awareness of how truth persists. As Chapter 5 closes, the science stands proven not just by success, but by endurance. It has shown that justice does not expire, that evidence does not lose its voice, and that the past, no matter how deeply buried, remains accessible to those willing to listen carefully. The story now turns toward the people who carry this responsibility forward. The investigators, genealogists, and institutions navigating the balance between power and restraint. In the next chapter, the focus shifts to the ethical frontier, the line where science meets society, and where every answer demands a question in return. Chapter 6. The Ethical Frontier. As genetic genealogy became firmly embedded in modern investigations, the conversation inevitably shifted toward ethics. Not because the technology had failed, but because it had succeeded so completely. When a tool becomes powerful enough to reshape justice, it demands careful examination. Investigators, scientists, lawmakers, and the public were all forced to confront the same central question. Just because something can be done, should it always be done? The heart of this debate was consent. Millions of people had submitted their DNA to genealogy databases for personal reasons. They wanted to learn about ancestry, health traits, or distant relatives. They did not submit their DNA to assist criminal investigations. Yet genetic information is inherently shared. A person's DNA does not belong only to them. It connects them biologically to parents, siblings, cousins, and ancestors. When one individual uploaded their DNA, they unintentionally revealed information about others who had not consented at all. This reality made genetic genealogy unlike any other forensic tool. Fingerprints belong to one person. DNA belongs to a family. Privacy advocates raised concerns early. Could law enforcement access to genealogy databases become too broad? Could it expand beyond violent crimes? Could it lead to misuse or overreach? These concerns were not hypothetical. They reflected lessons learned from other technologies that had advanced faster than regulation. The fear was not that genetic genealogy would be used to solve crimes, but that it might eventually be used to monitor populations. This fear demanded safeguards, not dismissal. In response, many law enforcement agencies adopted strict internal rules. Genetic genealogy would be used only as a last resort. Cases had to involve severe violent crimes. All traditional investigative methods had to be exhausted first. Supervisory approval was required. Legal teams reviewed each request. These layers of oversight slowed the process deliberately. They ensured that urgency did not override principle. Investigators accepted this limitation because they understood what was at stake. Public trust was essential. Without it, the technology would lose legitimacy. Genealogy databases also evolved. Some chose to prohibit law enforcement access entirely. Others allowed it only when users explicitly opted in. Transparency policies were strengthened. Users were informed clearly about how their data could be used. Reports were published detailing how often law enforcement accessed databases and for what types of crimes. These measures were not cosmetic. They were foundational. They allowed genetic genealogy to continue without becoming a source of fear. Another ethical concern centered on misidentification. Genetic genealogy relies on probability and interpretation. Errors were possible if data was misread or assumptions made too quickly. To address this, best practices emerged. Multiple genealogists reviewed family trees independently. Conclusions were peer-checked. Investigators were trained to treat genealogical leads as hypotheses, not evidence. Confirmation always required a direct DNA match obtained legally. These safeguards protected innocent people from harm. There was also the question of proportionality. Should the same technology used to solve decades-old homicides be applied to lesser offenses? Most agencies answered no. Limiting use preserved moral clarity. It reinforced that genetic genealogy existed to address the most serious harms, not to expand surveillance. This restraint distinguished it from many other investigative technologies that had gradually broadened in scope. For families of victims, ethical concerns often felt abstract compared to the pain of unanswered questions. Many expressed willingness to accept genealogical methods if it meant learning the truth. Others felt conflicted. They worried about the implications for privacy while still yearning for closure. Investigators learned to navigate these emotions carefully. Ethical use was not just about policy. It was about empathy. This chapter represents a turning point. Genetic genealogy was no longer defined solely by what it could accomplish. It was defined by the boundaries placed around it. These boundaries did not weaken the technology. They strengthened it. They ensured that its power remained aligned with justice rather than convenience. As this ethical framework solidified, genetic genealogy found its place. Not as a threat to privacy, not as a cure-all, but as a carefully governed tool capable of reaching where others could not. Its legitimacy rested not on innovation alone, but on restraint. In the chapters ahead, the focus turns toward the future. How this technology continues to evolve, how laws adapt, and how society balances the promise of truth with the protection of individual rights. The frontier remains, but it is no longer uncharted. It is being navigated deliberately, one decision at a time. Genetic genealogy moved from specialized use into broader awareness. One truth became unavoidable. The success of the technology depended not on algorithms or databases, but on trust, public trust. Without it, participation would decline, access would be restricted, and the method would lose its foundation. Investigators and policymakers understood that this was not a tool they could impose. It was a tool that existed only because millions of people had chosen to share something deeply personal. Maintaining that trust required clarity, honesty, and restraint. One of the most significant developments during this period was the formalization of consent. Early genealogy databases had vague or limited policies regarding law enforcement access. As awareness grew, these policies evolved rapidly. Companies introduced clear opt-in and opt-out mechanisms. Users were given explicit choices about whether their DNA could be used for criminal investigations. Some platforms required active consent before any law enforcement search could occur. Others restricted access entirely. This diversity of approaches reflected a broader social conversation about boundaries. For many users, the decision was complex. Some felt strongly that their DNA should never be used beyond personal research. Others believed contributing to justice was a moral good. Many occupied a space in between, supportive of solving violent crimes but concerned about potential misuse. These varied perspectives shaped policy. There was no single answer that satisfied everyone. Instead, systems were built to respect choice. This respect became central to the legitimacy of genetic genealogy. Law enforcement agencies adjusted accordingly. Investigators learned which databases permitted access and under what conditions. Requests were documented. Searches were narrow and case-specific. Phishing expeditions were discouraged. Each inquiry left a record, ensuring accountability. This transparency was not incidental. It was essential. Without it, skepticism could easily turn into resistance. Education also played a crucial role. As media coverage expanded, agencies made efforts to explain genetic genealogy in plain terms. Public briefings focused on process rather than drama. How partial matches worked. Why family trees were built. Why direct DNA confirmation was still required. This education reduced fear. It replaced mystery with understanding. People were more willing to trust a method they could comprehend. Another layer of trust involved the families of those indirectly implicated. Genetic genealogy does not accuse relatives of crimes, but it can bring scrutiny into families that had no prior connection to law enforcement. Investigators learned to approach these situations delicately. Communication mattered. Language mattered. Being transparent about what was known and what was not prevented misunderstanding. Respecting the dignity of those involved preserved the human element of the work. There were also legal considerations. Courts examined whether using publicly available genetic data violated reasonable expectations of privacy. In most cases, rulings supported the practice when conducted within established guidelines. Judges emphasized that investigators accessed information voluntarily shared by users under the terms of the platforms. Still, these decisions reinforced the need for clear consent policies. Ambiguity benefited no one. As trust frameworks solidified, a balance emerged. Genetic genealogy became neither hidden nor sensationalized. It occupied a defined space, powerful but governed, effective but limited. This balance allowed the technology to continue evolving without provoking backlash. It demonstrated that innovation and ethics could advance together. What became clear during this phase was that genetic genealogy was as much a social practice as a scientific one. It required cooperation across communities, institutions, and generations. It relied on people believing that their participation served a greater good without compromising personal rights. This belief could not be forced. It had to be earned continuously. As this segment concludes, The ethical landscape around genetic genealogy stands more clearly defined than ever before. Consent is central. Transparency is expected. Oversight is standard. These principles do not slow justice. They protect it. The next segment explores what happens when this balance is tested, when technology advances faster than policy, and when society must decide how far it is willing to go in pursuit of truth, even when the answers lie buried deep within the past. Genealogy settled into its role within criminal investigations. It became clear that the technology was no longer just a forensic tool. It was a social force, one that required constant negotiation between what was possible and what was acceptable. Science had moved faster than law, faster than culture, and faster than public understanding. Bridging that gap became one of the most delicate challenges of this era. At the center of this tension was the idea of collective responsibility. Genetic genealogy worked because millions of people participated in ancestry testing, often without thinking beyond personal curiosity. Their choices created a shared resource, one that could illuminate crimes far removed from their own lives. This raised a fundamental question. To what extent does individual data contribute to collective justice? And who gets to decide how that contribution is used? These were not questions science could answer alone. Policymakers began engaging more deeply with these issues. Some jurisdictions drafted legislation outlining when and how genetic genealogy could be used. Others issued guidelines rather than laws, allowing flexibility as technology evolved. This patchwork approach reflected uncertainty, but also caution. Lawmakers recognized that rigid rules could quickly become outdated. At the same time, the absence of guidance risked misuse. The solution, imperfect but practical, was ongoing review. Policies were designed to be revisited, revised, and refined as understanding grew. International perspectives added further complexity. Genetic genealogy databases were global. DNA did not respect national borders. A crime committed in one country could be connected to relatives in another. This raised questions about jurisdiction, data sharing, and legal compatibility. Some nations embraced genetic genealogy enthusiastically. Others restricted its use or banned law enforcement access altogether. These differences underscored a deeper truth. Attitudes toward privacy, justice, and state authority vary widely across cultures. Genetic genealogy exposed those differences more clearly than ever before. Within communities, reactions were equally varied. Some saw the technology as a triumph of science serving justice. Others viewed it with suspicion, concerned about potential misuse or unintended consequences. These concerns were not rooted in misunderstanding alone. History had taught many communities to be cautious about surveillance and data collection. Investigators who recognized this history approached outreach differently. They listened. They explained. They acknowledged limits. This dialogue helped prevent polarization and reinforced the importance of trust building beyond policy. Another important consideration was permanence. Once genetic data exists, it does not disappear easily. Even if a user deletes their profile, copies may persist in backups or shared datasets. This permanence heightened concerns about long-term implications. What decisions made today might mean decades from now. Genetic genealogy forced society to think in longer time frames, not just about solving past crimes, but about protecting future generations. Researchers and ethicists contributed by developing frameworks for responsible innovation. They emphasized principles such as proportionality, necessity, and accountability. Genetic genealogy should be used only when the potential benefit outweighed the intrusion, only when other methods had failed, only with safeguards in place. These principles did not eliminate debate. They structured it. One of the most telling signs of maturity in this field was restraint. Investigators learned that not using genetic genealogy could be as important as using it. Choosing not to pursue a genealogical lead demonstrated respect for boundaries. It reinforced that justice was not a race. It was a process, As this chapter concludes, genetic genealogy stands at a crossroads between science and society. Its power is undeniable. Its risks are real. Its future depends on how carefully it is integrated into broader systems of law and ethics. The technology itself does not decide. People do. What remains clear is that genetic genealogy has permanently altered how society thinks about evidence, time, and connection. It has shown that the past is not isolated. It is woven into the present through biology and choice. Navigating that reality requires more than innovation. It requires wisdom. In the chapters ahead, the focus shifts forward to how this technology continues to evolve, to what future advancements may bring, and to how justice adapts in a world where truth no longer fades quietly with time. Chapter 7. The Future of Cold Case Justice. As genetic genealogy moved from breakthrough to standard practice, investigators began to see its deeper significance. It was not merely a new tool added to the forensic toolbox. It represented a fundamental shift in how cold cases were understood. For decades, unsolved crimes were often treated as static. Evidence was cataloged, files archived, and time slowly eroded hope. Genetic genealogy disrupted that finality. It reframed cold cases not as failures, but as investigations waiting for the world to change. This shift altered the psychology of law enforcement. Detectives who once closed files with quiet resignation began to view them as living records. Evidence was no longer frozen in the year a crime occurred. It was dynamic, capable of revealing new information as databases expanded and analytical methods improved. A hair collected in the 1970s could suddenly become relevant in the 2020s. A partial profile once considered useless could now point toward an entire family network. Time itself became an investigative ally rather than an enemy. Cold case units adapted their strategies accordingly. Instead of reopening cases only when new tips arrived, agencies conducted systematic reviews. Evidence was reassessed through the lens of modern science. Biological samples were retested. Old assumptions were questioned. Investigators asked not what they knew, but what they might have overlooked. Genetic genealogy encouraged humility. It reminded professionals that certainty is often provisional. This new approach also reshaped how victims' families were engaged. For many families, years of silence had created emotional distance from the justice system. Some had learned to live with ambiguity. Others carried unresolved grief quietly. When investigators reinitiated contact decades later, the conversations were delicate. Hope had to be offered carefully. Genetic genealogy did not guarantee answers. It offered possibility. Managing expectations became as important as managing evidence. Yet even cautious optimism mattered. Families reported feeling acknowledged again. Their cases were no longer forgotten. The act of re-examination itself carried meaning. It communicated that time had not diminished the value of the lives lost. Genetic genealogy restored a sense of dignity to cases that had long existed only as file numbers. From an institutional perspective, this evolution required investment. Training detectives to understand genealogical principles took time. Partnerships with civilian genealogists became common. These collaborations blended law enforcement expertise with specialized research skills. The success of such partnerships demonstrated that modern justice increasingly depended on interdisciplinary cooperation. Science, history, and investigation converged. Another transformation occurred in how evidence preservation was prioritized. Agencies became more aware of the long-term value of biological material. Storage protocols improved. Documentation standards were strengthened. What might seem insignificant today could become critical decades later. Genetic genealogy taught agencies to think generationally. Evidence preservation was no longer just about immediate trials. It was about future possibilities. The ripple effects extended beyond homicide cases. While genetic genealogy remained focused on violent crimes, Its success prompted broader discussions about forensic innovation. It encouraged investment in other emerging methods. It reinforced the idea that solving crime was not solely about speed. It was about persistence, adaptation, and learning. There was also a cultural shift in how society perceived unresolved cases. Media coverage evolved. Stories emphasized patience rather than spectacle. The narrative moved away from sensationalism toward quiet perseverance. Genetic genealogy contributed to this tone. It showed that justice could arrive calmly, without drama, through methodical work and respect for process. As this segment closes, the future of cold case justice appears fundamentally changed. The question is no longer whether some crimes can be solved after decades. The question is when. Genetic genealogy has altered expectations permanently. It has taught investigators, families, and the public that silence does not mean resolution. It means waiting. In the next segment, we examine how this future continues to unfold, how advancing technology may further redefine investigation, and how society prepares for a world where even the oldest secrets remain reachable, waiting patiently for science to catch up. Genealogy continued to shape the future of cold case investigations. One of its most profound effects was how it redefined the role of time itself. In traditional policing, time was an adversary. Witness memories faded. Evidence degraded. Leads went cold. The longer a case remained unsolved, the less likely it was to ever be resolved. Genetic genealogy inverted that logic. Time no longer worked against investigators. In many cases, it worked for them. Every year, more people submitted their DNA to ancestry databases. Family trees expanded. Records were digitized. Historical data became searchable in ways that had never been possible before. A suspect who once left behind no usable trail could now be connected indirectly through distant relatives who had never heard of the crime. The longer time passed, the more likely it became that someone, somewhere, would unknowingly create a genetic link. Silence was no longer an endpoint. It was a waiting period. This transformation reshaped investigative patience. Detectives learned that restraint could be strategic. Instead of forcing progress through unreliable leads or public pressure, some cases benefited from quiet observation. Evidence was preserved. Files were maintained. And investigators monitored developments in technology and databases, ready to act when conditions aligned. Justice became less about urgency and more about timing. This approach also changed how investigators interpreted failure. A case that stalled was no longer considered lost. It was simply incomplete. This shift reduced burnout within cold case units. Detectives reported renewed motivation, knowing that advancements beyond their control could eventually unlock answers. Genetic genealogy gave them permission to hope without desperation. For victims' families, this new relationship with time was complex. Many had lived through decades of unanswered questions. Some had built emotional distance as a form of survival. When cases resurfaced after long periods of inactivity, it stirred conflicting emotions. Hope returned, but so did pain. Investigators learned to approach families carefully, acknowledging both the promise of new technology and the uncertainty that still remained. Time also influenced accountability in unexpected ways. Suspects identified through genetic genealogy were often older. Their lives had changed. Some had lived quietly, blending into communities, raising families, working ordinary jobs. Arrests were rarely dramatic. They were subdued, almost anticlimactic. Yet their significance was immense. They demonstrated that time did not erase responsibility. It merely delayed recognition. Courts grappled with these late-stage prosecutions. Judges weighed the reliability of decades-old evidence against modern forensic confirmation. In many cases, genetic genealogy strengthened prosecutions by providing clarity where ambiguity once existed. The science did not rely on memory. It relied on biology. And biology, unlike recollection, did not fade. There was also a broader societal implication. Genetic genealogy challenged the assumption that aging equaled immunity. The belief that crimes could be outlived quietly lost credibility. This did not create fear so much as recalibration. Accountability became decoupled from immediacy. Justice became something that could arrive slowly, deliberately, even unexpectedly. This recalibration extended to how institutions archived information. Cold case files were reorganized with future analysis in mind. Evidence inventories were digitized. Metadata was improved. Agencies prepared for a world where data longevity mattered more than ever. Genetic genealogy encouraged long-term thinking at every level. Another subtle shift occurred in public perception. The narrative around unsolved crimes softened. Instead of finality, there was anticipation. Stories were framed not as endings, but as pauses. This reframing mattered. It reduced cynicism. It encouraged patience. It reinforced trust in systems that were adapting rather than stagnating. As this segment concludes, time stands revealed as a partner rather than an enemy. Genetic genealogy transformed waiting into strategy and patience into power. It taught investigators and society alike that the passage of years does not diminish truth. It enriches it. In the next segment, the focus turns to innovation still on the horizon. New technologies, new ethical questions, and the next evolution of forensic science. The story of genetic genealogy is not finished. It is still unfolding, quietly, year by year, strand by strand. Genealogy continued to evolve. Its most enduring legacy became clear. It introduced a new philosophy into criminal investigation, one where justice no longer operated on a deadline. For most of modern history, the justice system functioned under an unspoken assumption. That time weakened cases. That urgency mattered more than patience. That if answers did not arrive quickly, they might never arrive at all. Genetic genealogy dismantled that assumption quietly, without spectacle, replacing it with something far more enduring. This shift did not happen overnight. It unfolded case by case, arrest by arrest, confirmation by confirmation. Each solved cold case reinforced the same idea, that accountability could exist independently of time. That responsibility did not expire. And that truth, once thought unreachable, could still be found long after witnesses had gone silent and memories had faded. For investigators, this removed an invisible pressure. They no longer felt compelled to force conclusions prematurely. Instead, they learned to preserve, document, and wait. Waiting became an act of intention rather than defeat. Evidence was treated as a long-term investment. Every preserved sample carried future potential. Every carefully logged detail became part of a record that might speak decades later. This philosophy reshaped investigative culture. Detectives began thinking generationally. They understood that some answers might not come during their careers, but that did not make the work less meaningful. It made it more durable. Genetic genealogy allowed justice to become a shared effort across time, passed from one generation of investigators to the next. For families of victims, justice without a deadline carried both comfort and complexity. Some found peace knowing that the door to truth was never fully closed. Others struggled with the uncertainty of waiting. Genetic genealogy did not promise closure. It promised possibility. And possibility, while hopeful, required patience. Investigators learned to support families through this ambiguity, offering honesty rather than certainty. There were also moments of profound reckoning. When arrests occurred decades after crimes, communities were forced to confront uncomfortable realities. That people capable of immense harm could live unnoticed for years. That evil did not always announce itself. These realizations were unsettling, but they were also clarifying. Genetic genealogy stripped away illusions about time's ability to heal or erase. It showed that time merely conceals until science reveals. The legal system adapted gradually. Courts recognized that justice delayed did not equate to justice denied when supported by reliable evidence. Prosecutors refined strategies for presenting long-spanning cases. Juries were guided through timelines that stretched across decades. Genetic evidence anchored these narratives, providing a stable point amid the passage of years. Biology became the constant where human memory faltered. This new understanding extended beyond individual cases. It influenced how society thought about crime prevention, accountability, and trust in institutions. The knowledge that crimes could be solved long after they occurred subtly altered expectations. It reinforced the idea that silence was temporary, that the truth had a way of resurfacing. Perhaps the most significant outcome of this shift was humility. Genetic genealogy reminded investigators, policymakers, and the public that certainty is rare and patience is essential. It encouraged systems to remain open rather than rigid, adaptive rather than final. Justice became a process rather than a moment. As Chapter 7 comes to a close, the transformation is unmistakable. Genetic genealogy did more than solve cold cases. It redefined how justice interacts with time. It removed expiration dates from accountability. It taught society to wait without surrendering hope. In the chapters ahead, the story moves toward what comes next. The innovations still emerging, the questions still unanswered, and the future shaped by a technology that listens patiently to the past, waiting for it to speak. Chapter 8. The next evolution of forensic science. As genetic genealogy settled into its place within modern investigations, attention naturally shifted toward what might come next. The success of this technology did not signal an endpoint. It marked a beginning. Forensic science, long defined by incremental progress, entered a period of accelerated evolution. Genetic genealogy had shown what was possible when biology, data, and patience converged. Now researchers and investigators began asking how far that convergence could go. One of the most significant developments on the horizon involved the refinement of DNA analysis itself. Early forensic DNA relied on limited markers designed primarily for matching individuals. Genetic genealogy expanded that scope by interpreting relationships across generations. But scientists were already exploring deeper layers of genetic information. Advances in sequencing technology allowed for more detailed genetic profiles from smaller, older, or degraded samples. Evidence once considered unusable could now yield insight. This expanded the pool of cases eligible for renewed examination. Another emerging area was phenotypic prediction. This method aimed to infer physical traits from DNA, such as hair color, eye color, and approximate ancestry. While not a replacement for identification, it offered investigators additional context. Used carefully, it could narrow investigative focus without replacing traditional methods. However, this capability also raised ethical concerns. Predicting appearance carried risks of bias and misinterpretation. As with genetic genealogy, restraint and oversight became essential. Artificial intelligence also began intersecting with forensic genealogy. Machine learning algorithms showed promise in analyzing vast datasets more efficiently than human researchers alone. These systems could identify patterns across millions of records, accelerating the process of building family trees and evaluating connections. Yet investigators understood that speed was not the primary goal. Accuracy was. AI was positioned as an assistant rather than a decision-maker, augmenting human judgment rather than replacing it. Another frontier involved international collaboration. Genetic data did not respect borders, and crimes often involved movement across regions or countries. As databases grew globally, so did the potential for cross-border connections. This required cooperation between legal systems with differing standards and privacy laws. Establishing shared protocols became a priority. The goal was not uniformity, but compatibility, ensuring that ethical standards traveled alongside data. Public engagement also continued to evolve. As awareness of genetic genealogy increased, education became more nuanced. The conversation moved beyond how cases were solved toward why boundaries mattered. Transparency about limitations and safeguards helped prevent unrealistic expectations. Genetic genealogy was powerful, but it was not omniscient. Acknowledging uncertainty preserved credibility. Within law enforcement, training adapted accordingly. Detectives learned not only how to interpret genealogical leads, but how to communicate them responsibly. Understanding the science became as important as understanding the human impact. This interdisciplinary approach strengthened investigations and reduced errors. As forensic science advanced, one principle remained constant. Innovation required accountability. Each new capability demanded corresponding ethical reflection. Genetic genealogy had demonstrated that balance was possible. The next generation of forensic tools would need to follow that example. This segment marks a transition from reflection to anticipation. The story of genetic genealogy is no longer just about solving the past. It is about shaping the future. A future where justice evolves thoughtfully, guided by both scientific progress and social responsibility. In the next segment, we explore how these advancements challenge existing legal frameworks, how laws adapt to technologies that did not exist when they were written, and how society navigates the delicate intersection of innovation, rights, and justice in a world where truth becomes increasingly accessible. Forensic science advanced beyond what lawmakers had anticipated. Legal systems around the world were placed under quiet but increasing pressure. Genetic genealogy and its emerging successors did not simply introduce new evidence types. They challenged foundational assumptions about privacy, consent, and the scope of lawful investigation. Laws written in an era of fingerprints and eyewitness testimony were now being asked to govern technologies that could trace family lines across centuries. Courts were among the first institutions forced to adapt. Judges confronted cases where the initial lead did not come from a suspect or a witness, but from a statistical probability derived from shared genetic markers. Defense attorneys questioned whether such leads constituted searches. Prosecutors argued that they were investigative tools, not evidence themselves. Through careful rulings, courts began to draw distinctions. Genealogical research was treated as intelligence gathering. The evidentiary threshold still rested on direct DNA matches and corroborating proof. This distinction proved critical. It preserved constitutional protections while allowing innovation to continue. Courts emphasized process over outcome. How investigators obtained and used genealogical information mattered as much as what that information revealed. This emphasis reinforced due process and prevented shortcuts motivated by technological confidence. Legislators responded unevenly. Some jurisdictions enacted specific statutes governing forensic genealogy. These laws defined permissible crimes, required judicial oversight, and mandated transparency. Other regions relied on internal law enforcement policies rather than formal legislation. This inconsistency reflected the novelty of the field. Policymakers were cautious, aware that premature regulation could stifle beneficial tools, while delayed regulation risked misuse. Public hearings became part of the process. Experts testified about the science. Privacy advocates voiced concerns. Victims' families spoke about the importance of resolution. These discussions rarely produced simple answers. Instead, they clarified values. Most societies agreed on one principle: that the most serious crimes justified the most serious investigative tools. Beyond that, consensus varied. Another challenge involved data retention. Genetic information, once collected, raised questions about duration. How long should profiles remain accessible? Who controlled deletion? Could data submitted today be used differently tomorrow? These questions had no universal solutions. Some laws required periodic review. Others allowed indefinite retention with safeguards. The common thread was accountability. Decisions about genetic data could not be invisible. International law added further complexity. A genealogical lead generated in one country might implicate a suspect in another with different legal standards. Mutual legal assistance treaties struggled to keep pace. Investigators learned to navigate these gaps carefully, prioritizing cooperation over confrontation. Respecting sovereignty became as important as pursuing answers. Throughout this legal evolution, one theme remained consistent. Flexibility was essential. Technology would continue advancing. Static laws would quickly become obsolete. Legal systems began embracing principles-based regulation rather than prescriptive rules. These frameworks focused on necessity, proportionality, and oversight. They allowed adaptation without sacrificing core rights. As this segment concludes, it becomes clear that law is not chasing technology blindly. It is learning to walk alongside it. Genetic genealogy forced legal systems to confront change thoughtfully. The result was not perfection, but progress. A recognition that justice must evolve without abandoning its foundations. In the next segment, we turn to the human dimension of this evolution. How investigators, families, and communities experience justice in an age where answers arrive slowly, sometimes decades later, guided by science that listens patiently to the past. As genetic genealogy and emerging forensic technologies continued to reshape investigations, their most profound effects were felt not in laboratories or courtrooms, but in people's lives. Behind every dataset, every profile, and every statistical match were human stories marked by loss, waiting, and unresolved questions. Science could identify connections, but it could not measure the emotional weight carried by those left behind. This human dimension became increasingly central as cold cases reopened and long-silent truths resurfaced. For families of victims, scientific progress brought a complex mixture of hope and restraint. Many had lived for decades with unanswered questions. Their grief had evolved into something quieter but no less present. When investigators re-entered their lives with news of new technology, reactions varied. Some welcomed the renewed attention. Others guarded themselves against disappointment. Genetic genealogy did not promise certainty. It promised possibility. And possibility required emotional courage. Investigators learned that communication mattered as much as technique. Explaining the process clearly, without raising unrealistic expectations, became a vital skill. Families needed to understand that genetic genealogy could take months or years, and that it might not lead to definitive answers at all. Honesty preserved trust. It allowed hope to exist alongside realism. There were also moments of profound closure. When identifications were finally made, families often described a quiet relief rather than celebration. The end of uncertainty allowed grief to change shape. It became anchored to truth. Even painful answers were sometimes easier to bear than endless wondering. Genetic genealogy did not heal loss, but it restored narrative. It answered the question of what happened, even when the answer was devastating. For investigators, these outcomes reinforced the responsibility that came with scientific power. Solving a case was not just an achievement. It was an intrusion into lives shaped by absence. Detectives became stewards of truth, tasked with delivering it gently. This awareness influenced investigative culture. Success was measured not only by arrests, but by respect shown throughout the process. Communities also felt the impact. Cold case resolutions sometimes revealed offenders who had lived quietly among them for years. This realization unsettled assumptions about familiarity and safety. It challenged the belief that danger was always visible. Genetic genealogy forced communities to confront the uncomfortable truth that time and normalcy could coexist with hidden harm. At the same time, these resolutions reinforced collective responsibility. They demonstrated that justice was not solely the work of institutions. It depended on shared participation, whether through DNA submissions, record keeping, or public support for ethical safeguards. Communities became indirect partners in accountability. As forensic technology advanced, there was growing recognition that progress required empathy. Science alone could not guide decisions about when to pursue a lead or how to disclose findings. Those decisions rested on values: respect for victims, care for families, awareness of unintended consequences. This segment closes with a reminder that technology is never neutral. It reflects the intentions and priorities of those who wield it. Genetic genealogy's greatest achievement may not be the cases it solved, but the standards it set. That justice can advance without sacrificing humanity. That truth can emerge slowly, thoughtfully, and with care. As we move toward the final chapters, the focus turns to legacy. What genetic genealogy leaves behind, how it reshapes expectations of justice, and how society chooses to carry forward a tool that listens patiently to the past while shaping the future. Chapter 9. A permanent shift in justice. By the time genetic genealogy became widely accepted within the criminal justice system, it was no longer viewed as an experiment or exception. It had become a permanent shift in how justice understood itself. The idea that crimes could remain unresolved indefinitely began to dissolve. In its place emerged a quieter, more persistent belief that truth could wait, that accountability could arrive slowly, and that the past was never as unreachable as it once seemed. This shift carried deep implications for how societies thought about responsibility. For generations, justice systems operated within practical limits. If a case remained unsolved beyond a certain point, it faded into history. Investigators moved on. Families were left with uncertainty. Genetic genealogy disrupted this finality. It introduced a new timeline, one governed not by human memory, but by biological continuity. DNA did not forget. It did not erode. It endured. As more cold cases were solved, patterns emerged. Crimes once considered isolated were revealed as part of broader narratives. Serial offenders were identified decades later, their histories reconstructed through genetic connections rather than confessions. This reconstruction altered public understanding of criminal behavior. It showed that patterns could exist unseen for years, hidden not by sophistication but by time. Genetic genealogy brought those patterns into view. For legal systems, this permanence demanded adaptation. Prosecutors prepared cases that spanned decades. Jurors were asked to consider timelines that crossed generations. Judges weighed evidence collected in different eras under evolving standards. The success of these cases demonstrated that justice could be both patient and precise. That reliability did not depend on immediacy. It depended on integrity. This permanence also influenced how institutions valued preservation. Evidence storage became a long-term commitment rather than a temporary measure. Records were digitized with future analysis in mind. Agencies invested in maintaining biological samples indefinitely. Genetic genealogy taught institutions to think beyond election cycles, beyond careers, beyond lifetimes. Justice became a legacy project. Public expectations shifted as well. The idea that some crimes might never be solved lost credibility. While not every case would find answers, the assumption of impossibility weakened. This change altered how communities engaged with unsolved crimes. Hope became cautious but enduring. Silence became provisional rather than final. At the same time, this permanence raised important questions about closure. If justice could arrive at any moment, could grief ever truly rest? Some families struggled with this uncertainty. Others found comfort in it. Genetic genealogy did not prescribe emotional outcomes. It expanded the range of possibilities. This chapter marks a turning point. Genetic genealogy was no longer about catching killers alone. It was about redefining the relationship between time, evidence, and accountability. It removed the notion of expiration from justice. It replaced it with endurance. As the story continues, the focus turns to legacy. How this shift reshapes future generations of investigators. How society remembers crimes long past. And how justice, once bound by time, learns to exist without it. As genetic genealogy reshaped the mechanics of justice, it also reshaped something less tangible but equally powerful: collective memory. For much of modern history, unresolved crimes slowly slipped from public awareness. They survived in archives, in private grief, and in fragmented recollections, but rarely in shared consciousness. Genetic genealogy altered that pattern. It taught society how to remember differently, not with urgency or spectacle, but with patience. Cold cases were no longer defined solely by their age. They were defined by their potential. This subtle shift changed how communities related to unresolved crimes. Instead of asking why a case had not been solved, people began asking how it might be solved one day. This reframing mattered. It replaced resignation with anticipation. It allowed memory to remain active rather than mournful. Media coverage evolved alongside this change. Stories about cold cases adopted a quieter tone. Journalists emphasized process over drama. Advances in science became part of the narrative. Viewers and readers were invited to understand rather than react. Genetic genealogy encouraged storytelling that unfolded slowly, mirroring the investigations themselves. This pacing fostered empathy rather than outrage. Educational institutions also responded. Criminal justice programs integrated forensic genealogy into their curricula. Students learned not only the science, but the ethical frameworks that governed its use. Future investigators were trained to think long-term, to respect boundaries, and to understand the human impact of delayed answers. Memory became something to steward, not exploit. Families of victims experienced this cultural shift intimately. Many found that renewed public interest brought validation. Their loved ones were not forgotten. At the same time, increased visibility could reopen wounds. Genetic genealogy forced society to confront the responsibility that comes with remembering. Attention needed to be respectful. Curiosity needed to be restrained. The goal was understanding, not consumption. There was also a deeper psychological impact. Knowing that crimes could be solved decades later influenced how individuals perceived accountability. The idea that wrongdoing could remain hidden indefinitely lost its power. This did not create fear. It created awareness. Actions left traces. Time did not erase them. Genetic genealogy reinforced a moral continuity between past and present. Communities learned that memory was not passive. It required maintenance. Preserving evidence, supporting families, and investing in science were all acts of remembrance. Justice became a collective endeavor across time. Genetic genealogy made it clear that remembering was not about dwelling on the past. It was about remaining open to truth whenever it arrived. As this segment closes, society stands changed not just by new technology, but by a new relationship with memory. Cold cases are no longer frozen moments. They are ongoing conversations between past and present. Genetic genealogy has given those conversations a voice. In the final segment of this chapter, the focus turns inward, to the lessons this transformation leaves behind, to how justice, memory, and responsibility intertwine, and to what it means to live in a world where the past is never truly silent. Genetic genealogy became woven into the fabric of justice. Society faced a quieter, more introspective challenge, learning how to live with a past that could speak at any moment. For generations, time had provided a sense of emotional distance. Events faded, stories softened. Pain, while never gone, became less immediate. Genetic genealogy disrupted that distance. It reminded the world that the past was not dormant. It was listening, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to be heard. This realization changed how individuals related to history itself. Crimes once considered historical artifacts were reclassified as unresolved truths. They were not relics. They were unfinished stories. Genetic genealogy blurred the line between then and now, forcing society to acknowledge that time does not transform injustice into closure. Only truth can do that. For families of victims, this awareness brought mixed emotions. Some found comfort knowing that their loved one's story could still be told fully. Others struggled with the perpetual openness of grief. The possibility of answers arriving unexpectedly meant that mourning never reached a final chapter. Genetic genealogy asked families to exist in a space between hope and acceptance, a space that required extraordinary resilience. Investigators, too, felt this weight. Solving a decades-old case was not simply an achievement. It was a responsibility carried across time. Detectives often spoke about feeling connected to colleagues long retired or deceased. They inherited unfinished work. Genetic genealogy created a chain of effort that transcended individual careers. Justice became a relay rather than a race. This continuity reshaped institutional identity. Law enforcement agencies began seeing themselves as long-term custodians of truth rather than immediate problem solvers. Success was measured not just in arrests, but in preservation, in care, in the integrity of records maintained for future discovery. Genetic genealogy rewarded patience and foresight over speed. There was also a cultural reckoning. Society had to confront the discomfort of knowing that ordinary lives could conceal extraordinary harm, that neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances might carry histories unknown even to themselves. This understanding did not breed paranoia. It fostered humility. It challenged simplistic narratives about good and evil, reminding people that truth is often complex and delayed. Ethically, this awareness reinforced the need for restraint. Just because the past could speak did not mean it should always be forced to. Decisions about when to reopen cases required discernment. Genetic genealogy taught that justice was not about exposure for its own sake. It was about restoration of truth where harm had occurred. As this segment concludes, society stands altered by a technology that listens across generations. Genetic genealogy has not only solved crimes, it has changed how people understand time, memory, and responsibility. It has shown that the past is not behind us. It is alongside us, connected through biology and choice. The final chapter now approaches, one that reflects on what this transformation leaves behind, the lessons learned, the boundaries drawn, and the quiet promise that truth, when handled with care, can emerge even after decades of silence. Chapter 10. What Genetic Genealogy Leaves Behind. As the story of genetic genealogy reaches its final chapter, what remains is not a single arrest, a single breakthrough, or a single technological triumph. What remains is a transformation, one that reshaped justice quietly, methodically, and almost imperceptibly over time. Genetic genealogy did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived with patience, and in doing so, it left behind a new understanding of how truth endures. Before this technology existed, the limits of justice were often defined by human capacity, by memory, by witnesses, by time. When those elements failed, cases stalled, not because investigators stopped caring, but because the tools available had reached their edge. Genetic genealogy expanded that edge. It did not replace traditional investigation. It extended it across generations. One of the most lasting legacies of this shift is philosophical. Justice is no longer understood as something that must happen quickly to matter. It is understood as something that must happen correctly, even if that takes decades. This redefinition altered priorities across the criminal justice system. Speed became secondary to integrity. Closure became less about immediacy and more about accuracy. For investigators, this legacy is carried forward in how cases are preserved. Evidence is no longer treated as temporary. Biological samples are stored with the expectation that future science may unlock what current methods cannot. Case files are curated for investigators not yet born. Genetic genealogy taught institutions to work for an audience in the future, trusting that their patience will one day be rewarded. For families of victims, the legacy is more personal. Genetic genealogy did not promise healing, but it offered something equally important: recognition. It affirmed that their loss mattered enough to wait for, that the passage of time did not diminish the value of their loved one's life. Even when answers arrived late, they arrived with intention. There is also a legacy of restraint. Genetic genealogy succeeded not because it was used everywhere, but because it was used carefully. Boundaries were drawn. Oversight was enforced. Consent became central. These choices ensured that the technology did not become another source of harm. Instead, it became an example of how power can be exercised responsibly. The broader social impact is subtle but profound. Society learned that technology does not have to be loud to be transformative, that progress can be quiet, that justice can move slowly without losing meaning. Genetic genealogy shifted expectations not through force, but through consistency. As this segment closes, what genetic genealogy leaves behind is not a finished story. It is a framework, a way of thinking about truth, time, and responsibility. One that will continue to influence investigations long after the novelty has faded. In the next segment, we reflect on the future shaped by this legacy. What comes next for forensic science? And how society carries forward the lessons learned from a technology that taught us how to listen patiently to the past. Looking ahead, the future shaped by genetic genealogy is defined less by technological ambition and more by measured intention. The lesson carried forward is not simply that science can solve crimes, but that it must do so thoughtfully. Genetic genealogy demonstrated that progress does not require urgency. It requires patience, structure, and respect for consequence. These values now influence how future forensic tools are imagined and implemented. Emerging technologies continue to build upon the foundation genetic genealogy established. Advances in DNA sequencing grow more precise. Computational tools become more efficient. Databases expand steadily. Yet each innovation is approached with caution informed by experience. Investigators and scientists understand that capability must be balanced with responsibility. The success of genetic genealogy proved that restraint strengthens legitimacy rather than weakening effectiveness. Training for future investigators reflects this shift. New generations are taught to view technology not as a shortcut, but as an extension of ethical decision-making. They learn that tools do not replace judgment. They amplify it. Genetic genealogy serves as a case study in how science and values can coexist. It teaches that integrity is not an obstacle to progress. It is its foundation. Policy development continues to evolve alongside innovation. Rather than reacting to breakthroughs after they occur, lawmakers increasingly engage in anticipatory governance. They consult ethicists, scientists, and communities early. This collaborative approach acknowledges that technology shapes society long before it enters a courtroom. Genetic genealogy highlighted the importance of dialogue before deployment. The public's role also changes. Awareness of genetic data usage fosters more informed participation. Individuals make choices with greater understanding of long-term implications. Consent becomes meaningful rather than symbolic. This informed engagement strengthens trust and ensures that future tools operate within shared expectations. There is also an evolving understanding of justice itself. Genetic genealogy reframed justice as a continuum rather than an event. This perspective influences how institutions evaluate success. Resolution is valued, but so is transparency. Accountability is pursued, but so is dignity. The future shaped by this mindset is quieter, but more resilient. As this segment concludes, the path forward is clear in principle, if not in detail. Innovation will continue. Questions will arise. Boundaries will be tested. But the example set by genetic genealogy remains. that justice guided by patience, respect, and care can endure. In the final segment, we arrive at reflection, not on what genetic genealogy accomplished alone, but on what it taught us about listening to the past and carrying its lessons forward into a future where truth is neither rushed nor ignored. As the story of genetic genealogy reaches its quiet conclusion, what remains is not a sense of finality, but continuity. This technology did not close a chapter in the history of justice. It opened one that will continue to be written slowly, carefully, and with intention. Genetic genealogy taught the world how to listen, not just to data, but to time itself. For centuries, the past was treated as something that receded with distance. Events faded into archives. Memories softened. Crimes unresolved became footnotes. Genetic genealogy challenged that relationship. It showed that the past is not passive. It is preserved biologically, waiting for the moment when understanding catches up. This realization altered humanity's relationship with truth. Silence no longer implied disappearance. It implied patience. The most enduring lesson of genetic genealogy is humility. It reminded investigators, scientists, and society that certainty is rare and progress is incremental. Answers do not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes they emerge quietly, through years of preparation and restraint. This humility reshaped how success is defined. Solving a case became less about triumph and more about stewardship, caring for evidence, respecting boundaries, waiting responsibly. There is also a lesson in responsibility. Genetic genealogy worked because millions of people unknowingly participated in a shared effort. Their DNA submissions, personal choices made for private reasons, became part of a collective record. This interconnectedness carried moral weight. It required transparency. It required consent. It required constant reassessment. The success of genetic genealogy proved that shared power can be managed ethically when guided by clear principles. As society moves forward, the influence of this technology will persist even as tools evolve. Future innovations will be judged against the standard genetic genealogy set, not only by what they can achieve, but by how they are governed, by whether they honor dignity while pursuing truth, by whether they listen as carefully as they act. For families of victims, genetic genealogy leaves behind something fragile but meaningful: the knowledge that silence is not abandonment, that waiting does not equal forgetting, that truth, even delayed, can still arrive with respect. This understanding does not erase loss, but it affirms that loss matters. For investigators, the legacy is professional and personal. Genetic genealogy expanded what was possible while reinforcing what was essential. Patience, integrity, empathy. These values endure beyond any single technology. They define the future of justice more than algorithms ever could. As this final segment closes, the story settles into stillness. Genetic genealogy did not promise a world without unanswered questions. It promised a world willing to wait for answers responsibly, a world that understands that truth does not need urgency to be powerful. It needs care. And so the past continues to speak, quietly, patiently, through strands of DNA and years of restraint, not demanding attention, simply waiting for those willing to listen. This is where the story rests, not concluded, but carried forward. To understand why genetic genealogy succeeded where traditional methods failed, it helps to slow down and look closely at how DNA actually works. Not as a dramatic breakthrough, but as a quiet system of inheritance that has always existed. Every person carries two copies of their DNA, passed down from their parents. Those parents receive their DNA from their parents, and so on, stretching backward through generations. Along the way, pieces are shuffled, combined, and rearranged, but they are never completely erased. Small segments persist. These segments are the reason distant relatives can be identified even when they share only a tiny fraction of genetic material. What genetic genealogy does is recognize these shared segments and calculate the probability of a relationship. It does not say who someone is. It says how they might be connected. In practice, this process begins with a crime scene DNA profile. This profile is carefully cleaned, verified, and formatted so it can be compared against consumer genealogy databases. Unlike law enforcement databases, these platforms are designed to look for partial matches. They scan millions of profiles and return a list of people who share measurable segments of DNA with the unknown sample. Each result includes an estimate of how closely related the two individuals might be. Often, these matches are distant. Third cousins, fourth cousins, sometimes even further removed. To the untrained eye, these connections might seem useless, but to a genealogist, they are valuable starting points. From here, the work becomes deeply methodical. Genealogists begin building family trees for each match, tracing ancestors backward until they find common points where the trees intersect. This is where public records become essential. Birth records reveal parents. Marriage records link families. Census data shows who lived where and when. Obituaries list surviving relatives. Each document adds another piece to the puzzle. Slowly, overlapping family lines emerge. These overlaps suggest a shared ancestor somewhere in the past. Once that ancestor is identified, genealogists trace the family forward again, following every branch down to the present day. At this stage, the tree can become very large. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of descendants may appear. Most of them are quickly ruled out. Some are the wrong age. Some lived in different regions. Some are women when the suspect is known to be male. Others were too young or too old at the time of the crime. What remains is a narrowing group of individuals who fit both the genetic data and the known facts of the case. This process can take months, sometimes years. It requires patience and precision. One incorrect assumption can send the entire investigation in the wrong direction. What makes this approach powerful is not speed, but accumulation. Each small elimination strengthens what remains. The DNA does not accuse anyone. It simply points toward a family network. Traditional investigative work then takes over. Detectives examine employment records, military service, criminal history, and geographic movement. They compare timelines. They revisit witness statements. They look for behavioral patterns that align with the crime. Only when all of these elements converge does a suspect truly emerge. Importantly, confirmation still requires a direct DNA match. Investigators do not rely on genealogy alone. Once a potential suspect is identified, law enforcement must obtain their DNA legally, often through discarded items like cups, tissues, or trash left in public spaces. This DNA is then compared directly to the crime scene evidence. Only when that match is confirmed does the case move forward. In this way, genetic genealogy acts as a guide, not a verdict. This layered process addresses one of the biggest concerns surrounding the technology. It is not about guilt by association. It is about narrowing the field in a responsible, evidence-based way. Many people share DNA. Only one person committed the crime. Genetic genealogy helps investigators move from millions of possibilities to a manageable number, where traditional standards of proof can be applied. As this method became more widely understood, it reshaped investigative strategy. Cold cases were no longer reopened randomly. They were selected based on whether usable DNA existed. Agencies invested in preserving biological evidence more carefully. Training programs were developed to teach detectives how to work alongside genealogists. A new hybrid discipline emerged, blending science, history, and police work into a single process. This chapter of the story reveals something essential. DNA alone does not solve crimes. People do. Scientists, genealogists, investigators, and analysts working together over long periods of time. Genetic genealogy did not replace human judgment. It amplified it. It turned DNA into a map, but humans still had to choose which paths to follow. And as investigators grew more confident in reading this map, a realization settled in. If DNA could lead backward through generations to find one offender, it could do the same for many others. Cold cases were no longer isolated mysteries. They were connected by a shared truth. That time does not erase genetic evidence. It only waits for the right method to uncover it.